Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Well, this has been quite a time in federal politics, a week that will be long remembered as Where Were You When? For those in the government ranks and for those of us who cover such events in the political punditry, the most asked question following Monday's early morning I quit letter posted by then Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland on her X account was, well, have you ever seen anything like this? The resignation of Freeland on the day that she was set to deliver the Trudeau government's fiscal update went off like a bomb, leading to a scramble by the Prime Minister's office to quickly name a new Minister of Finance, now Dominic LeBlanc, and then post some big deficit numbers in the mini budget, and then the wait for what the Prime Minister was planning to do next. Welcome to The Big Story. Well, now that some time has passed, we've reached out to Darryl Bricker, Global CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, to try to break down what the heck just happened. Darryl, thanks for joining us. Good to talk to you.
Thanks for having me on, Mike.
Now, Darryl, when you saw those headlines breaking minute by minute on Monday morning, there were so many moving parts, and we really still don't know yet, as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story. So how do you, in your line of work as a watcher of public opinion, even assess this situation?
Well, the first thing I think of when I see things like this is understanding the current context and how this plays within what we already know about the state of public opinion when it comes to the status of the government and how people are looking at their political choices. So given that this is a government that's obviously back on its heels, that happened wasn't seen as, wasn't going to have an effect that was going to be neutral. We knew that it was probably going to be negative. Just how negative, it'll probably take a couple of days to sort out. So the next wave of polling, I think, will show whether or not the Liberals have dropped below their very low floor that they've recently established. I mean, what we've seen, Mike, is that over the space of the last 3 or 4 months, the Liberals' floor has gone from mid-20s down to low 20s or lower. So the question is, did they bust through that floor? And are they now in free fall? I mean, you can argue that they've been in free fall for a while, but really in free fall relative to the new floors that they've established. So that was basically what I was thinking. Like, how much worse can these things get?
Are we not, though, at a state where it's kind of a vacuum? We don't know specifically the Prime Minister's intentions. The reports indicating that the Zoom call that he held with Chrystia Freeland Friday indicated that Mark Carney was waiting in the wings to come into this government to ostensibly be the new finance minister. That seems to be a report that is now being refuted, that Carney hadn't signed on and has been radio silent. So is it a situation where that uncertainty just builds to the negativity, if you will, about the government?
Yeah, it really does, and particularly at a time in which Canadians have already said that they can't wait to really get an opportunity to pass judgment on this government. I think it heightens that sense that there needs to be a change. I mean, we put out a poll last week, Mike, that showed that 78% of Canadians said 78 said that we need to have a new party in power in Ottawa. That's as high as I've ever seen it, and this was before the events of Monday.
Did the fall economic statement have any play at the end of the day? I mean, that was supposed to be the big story Monday. It certainly wasn't. The deficit numbers were well above estimates, and yet and all, at the end of the day, it seems like that is almost a second thought at this point, because it's fine for the government to do a 5-year forecast for a government that may not even last the next few months.
Well, it's not like this government has a reputation with Canadians as being fiscally prudent. So that they busted through their deficit guardrail would probably not be a surprise to the Canadian public. The opposite probably would be a surprise to the Canadian public. So I think that whatever the bad news relative to the deficit situation was from the fall economic statement was something that people were already probably anticipating.
Did those numbers, when you hear, a $62 billion deficit, a $48 billion this year, and then on and on and on, does that in any way, shape, or form make it even more difficult for an incoming government or the next government to deal with a problem that doesn't seem to be getting any better?
Well, what it does is it sets a marker as to what the issue should be for governments to address. So The issue with this particular government is not so much the actual number as much as the direction. It always seems to be more every time they talk about it. So the question for the next government is, can they make it less? Now, what does less mean? Well, less means more than what it was just announced to be. So I think the numbers are generally more directional. It's really more about progress and actual progress rather than a commitment to progress.
What about the timing of how this all transpired this week? Parliament is now off for the next several weeks for the Christmas break. Do you think that gives Trudeau some time to consider? That's what the indication seems to be. And yet, before Parliament resumes, look, the Trump tariffs are going to happen potentially well before that. So theoretically, Christmas break may be happening, but it might not be as long as they first expected.
Yeah, well, there is a Christmas break. I don't know what the mechanism would be for calling back Parliament earlier. Maybe if the Prime Minister himself makes some sort of an announcement and asks for Parliament to come back earlier, maybe that can happen. I mean, in cooperation with the NDP, I suspect that they could be able to do that. But I think the only thing that I could think of is if the Prime Minister decides to make an announcement about his future, which he would definitely, I would expect, do outside of the House. And if that happens, then maybe whoever the appointed person is to run the government maybe could call the government back earlier. But one of the things on this, Mike, is that the Prime Minister doesn't have all the cards himself. I mean, Jagmeet Singh also announced that he thought that the Prime Minister should resign. And, they're hinting around that, the right non-confidence motion could get their support, and the government could fall even if the Prime Minister doesn't want it to fall. So there's a lot of cards to be played here, a lot of parliamentary intrigue to work itself out at a time in which Canadians are very worried about the cost of living, are not happy about the direction of the country, and very, very short term in their views of their own personal financial situation, and very troubled.
Well, let's delve deeper into that if we could, because that has been sort of the shifting narrative, just as inflation built and prices for everyone went up, cost of living became the top line issue. The government has tried; they've tried to put this narrative out there that they're helping, but at the same time, was anybody actually buying that when they still have to go to the grocery store and pay what they were paying for food?
No, in fact, they weren't, and that's the thing. I mean, so there's a couple of things to focus on here. One of them is, do people actually think that the problem is inflation? So is it the number that shows up in the report that's issued by Statistics Canada? And the answer is no. I mean, that's what they might call it, but what they're really talking about is the cost of living. So their check on whether or not prices are under control is every time that they go buy gas, every time they go to the grocery store, every time they consider things like the Christmas gifts that they're going to be buying for their friends and family. And at the moment, they're seeing prices going up for all of those things, at least in their mind. And then whatever is happening to the inflation number is not correlated to that, at least is the way that they look at it. The next thing is how they're actually dealing with this. And the way that they're dealing with it is they're cutting back. So every time we go out now and we ask people survey questions about, okay, say, for example, are you going to increase your spending this year for Christmas gifts? And we asked this after the announcement about the tax holiday, and that number's down by 10 compared to where it was last year. So if the effect of the contribution that the government was going to be making to the lives of people through tax relief was meant to inspire people to spend more, they certainly didn't get the message. So we're feeling very short term in our perspective, very oppressed in our perspective about the economy, and really looking at things to change.
Well, Chrystia Freeland's exit letter basically called that a political gimmick, the GST holiday. Was that again a communications failure, in as much as it seemed to be a plan that was cobbled together on a napkin at the very last minute, that hadn't been put in place months ago to really telegraph it and sell it and make it sound, whether it's more than it actually turned out to be, but, again, from a political spin standpoint.
Yeah, well, they probably were looking at what Doug Ford was doing in Ontario and seeing that, he had a pretty big lead over the Liberal Party, and this was kind of his strategy, so why don't we have a little bit of that? That's the way it felt like. But the difference is that this is not part of the profile that voters have for this particular government. And when they see this government spend a lot of money, they don't see it as being so much relief as them being imprudent. And that was reflected in the outgoing finance minister's letter. So I just look at the data and it just says, if this was supposed to inspire me to spend more, it didn't. And why didn't it? Well, because I think the public looked at it and said, this is probably more trouble than it's worth.
Well, from a narrative standpoint, getting back to the finance minister's resignation letter, it wasn't implied in that letter back to the prime minister, but there's a lot of discussion today about this idea that this was another strong woman cabinet minister being pushed to the sidelines in the Trudeau government. Is that, it sounds like piling on at this point, but is that another thing that people are going to look at, whether it's true or not, that they see this as a narrative of coming out of the government, that it's like, they say one thing, but they inevitably end up doing something else?
Yeah, I think that there is some merit to that. And given that they made such a big deal out of it. So if it was just a matter of course, and was the way that they operate, and their cabinet ended up being 50-50 based on merit or whatever, and it was just assumed, probably you wouldn't be facing this type of criticism that they're getting about the firing of a woman finance minister. But they made a big deal of it. So when they go in the other direction, obviously it really undermines their credibility on that. But I will remind your listeners that Justin Trudeau did exactly the same thing to Bill Morneau, previous finance minister. Exactly the same thing.
Well, it also could indicate how the PMO is run, in as much as, the concentration of power, that everything at the cabinet level had to go back through the prime minister's office for multiple checks and balances and sign off. Just the way this government is structured.
It seems at the moment to be very improvisational, very and focused on the looming election campaign, very focused on the prime minister's survival, and the charge that Chrystia Freeland made in her letter about people wanting the government to be focused on them rather than on themselves, I guess is kind of underscored by what we're talking about right now. And it's probably the way Canadians are looking at what's going on. But the improvisational nature of this, you announce it on Friday and you don't even know if you've got the person who's supposed to be the next Minister of Finance available for the cabinet shuffle, and then all of a sudden your current Minister of Finance leaves, drops a bomb on the way out the door, and you appoint Dominic LeBlanc as the Minister of Finance. That certainly doesn't look like Mark Carney. So you almost get the sense that Mark Carney played everybody here, and he wasn't going for Chrystia Freeland. He was actually going for the Prime Minister, and really undermined him. And it's going to be very difficult to see how he gets himself into the new year still with any hope of being able to win an upcoming election campaign.
Well, I'm wondering if those who are waiting in the wings to potentially take over as the leader of the Liberal Party do they wait to hear what Trudeau does next, or do they start again putting out more hints that they're going to put their name in the ring here to potentially replace him?
Well, you see, Chrystia Freeland sped up her biography coming out. Now, she didn't write it, and somebody else wrote it, and it wasn't necessarily an autobiography, but it's been sped up. You saw Melanie Joly had a profile in the New York Times about the preferred organ for Liberal aspirants. I would say the New York Times being reported there. I'm sure that you're going to be seeing. You saw the former Premier of British Columbia, Christy Clark, was attending a whole bunch of events in Ottawa over the space of the last couple of days and posting all sorts of pictures of herself meeting with Liberal luminaries. So even if there isn't a leadership race, there's a leadership race.
And does Mark Carney get involved? Let's see again.
Well, I'm unfortunately spent a long time in this game, Mike, and my Machiavellian instincts kick in whenever I see these kinds of things going on. And that, what happened on Friday and then happened again on Monday, and Mark Carney's involvement around all of that. As I said before, I don't think he was ever going for Chrystia Freeland.
Okay, so we're at year end, and typically this would be the time of year where you'd be doing your fearless forecast for the new year. But is it a state where is that even possible at this point to try to predict what's going to happen next year? How the mood of the country may or may not change? Is that even on the agenda right now?
Very difficult to say. I mean, when we go out and we do ask Canadians, do you think next year is going to be better than this year? People do say generally that they think it's going to be better. I wonder if that's more hope than reality. Maybe we've been down so long, through the space of the last couple of years that you can only be optimistic about what's going forward. But on the political front, I mean, one thing we can absolutely guarantee next year is that there will be an election. What will happen in that election? A little harder to guarantee, but we look like we're probably setting ourselves up for a change in government, which most Canadians are saying, as I said before, 78% of us saying that we want to see. So people will probably get some optimism out of that happening. The big issue that everybody's going to be watching is obviously what happens in the United States with Donald Trump and his 25% tariffs on Canada, and then what the effects of that will be. They won't happen. The effects won't be right away, but they will happen over time, and what that's going to do to the Canadian economy is very much going to worry Canadians, and they're going to be looking for our provincial and our national governments to somehow find a way of dealing with it. So I think we're going to have an issue that's going to be a year that's going to be dominated by domestic politics and our relationship with the United States, and you're going to be spending a lot of time reporting on both, I would think.
And maybe even adding an Ontario election into the mix too, but we'll leave that for another day. Okay.
Okay.
Good talking to you, Darryl. Appreciate it. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks again to Darryl Bricker, Global CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs. This has been The Big Story. Thanks for listening.